Airbnb is the absolute worst. How is this company even still in existence? What do you think about this, Lucas? Do you routinely rent out on Airbnb? Do you use these services? What does this say about the broader sharing economy?
Um, I wouldn't say it's the worst. It has been better. I would say that Airbnb is part of a revolution. I look to second order companies to come along that dispel some of the I don't some of the fees and the ridiculousness of Airbnb. But quite honestly, I much prefer renting an Airbnb, renting somebody's home, than having the hotel motel experience.
Well, if you had invested in Airbnb, you wouldn't have made anything. Look at this stock price. Like it started out at something like 150, and after 5 years of performance, it's slightly lower than it ever was, and you never really had an opportunity to make money. So if you were an investor in Airbnb, you certainly have gotten taken. And a lot of people are really upset about the way that Airbnb allows for fees to be distributed. You got these cleaning fees, hidden fees, and there's been a big backlash against that kind of hiding the way that they're doing pricing. So a lot of I think what Airbnb started out as, which was a way to casually monetize a room in your house or something that you had, has grown into this cottage industry of buying up housing, depressing the ability of people to rent in local areas and just generally causing chaos in the housing market. And a lot of people are very upset about the way that Airbnb has played out. And as far as the sharing economy has gone, this has been the place of a lot of frustration. And I'm not just going to level this at Airbnb. I'd throw VRBO and a lot of these other sharing economy companies in the mix. But it looks like Airbnb is poised to make some big changes to the way that they run their app, and it's poised to get even worse. And it sort of speaks to the march of what happens with Silicon Valley companies from where they start out to where they feel they have to go in the longer term to try to fuel growth or become the next everything app, which it sounds like Airbnb is trying to become. Everybody's trying to chase that WeChat model.
Well, you say WeChat. I was going to throw a joke out that maybe Airbnb should have followed up on that early April Fool's joke that they put out, and done a rent your desk out from work model, and taken over the WeWork phenomenon. But you've mentioned a couple of other players in here. I think VRBO is Airbnb came from New York City, VRBO from Aspen, Colorado, or a tiny town next to Aspen that was Basalt, Colorado. Um, and I think that we put them in the same basket today, but they were both different groups of people, different models that were converging at this point. That you also mentioned the sharing economy, and the sharing economy is not about sharing, but it did have foundational changes to how we live in the world today, and what business opportunities are out there.
Yeah, it's like they built this platform for the casual monetization of things that were ostensibly sitting idle, so you could try to make some money off of something that you could casually monetize. But then it became populated by those who made it their life's work. So I just don't know that how this is that much different than the way that landlords have traditionally operated and had houses or apartments or whatever that they're renting out. It gave a new place to search. It gave search aggregation, I suppose.
Well, there's the search aggregation part of it, but when I think about the sharing economy, and despite my constant agitation that there's no part of sharing in it, I think the biggest innovation that the sharing economy brought was technology to shorten the feasible window of a time span of rental. And so, because it's interesting if we think about, in some ways, the difference between the government or a landlord, in a lot of ways, it's the time window of rent. You know, we think about property taxes in one way as this onerous thing that goes to the government, but the thing about owning your house is that you only have to pay rent once a year. And usually if you're renting, quote unquote, renting a house, or there is a person between you and the government, they are collecting that money in a shorter time window, usually a month, but maybe a week, maybe every 2 weeks, maybe every day. And that's sort of the difference of the fundamental difference between what a hotel experience is, what a renter's experience is, and what owning your home is. So
Well, when I think about these sharing companies, really what I see is this enablement of breaking the law that was established about how these units were supposed to come online. If you think about what we saw with Uber and Lyft, they thumbed their nose at this idea that you had to have a license to run a taxi service, and they said, "Well, we're just not going to do that." And I think Airbnb and VRBO kind of did the exact same thing. It's like normally you need a certain kind of zoning, you need a certain type of license or permission to do this type of thing. And they were just like, we're just going to thumb our nose at that and we're just going to let it happen. And so to me, there is this aspect of, the anarchist capitalists that are just doing whatever they want, and they'll pick up the pieces later. But it also caused a lot of churn in the areas where this was occurring, because in some ways zoning helps to define what is acceptable in certain areas, and that can be a good thing to keep certain types of activities out of certain types of areas. It's why you have red light districts.
well, as a municipal socialist, I totally agree, and I understand this angle, but I also think that we
Wait,
are.
go back to municipal socialist. That's the first time I've ever heard that. Those are two words that I don't hear put next to each other very often, juxtaposed, if you will.
Well, I depending on the level of government, I have, everybody sort of categorizes themselves as conservative, Republican, libertarian, what have you. But depending on the tax base of different levels of government, I have very different expectations of what those should be. So I often call myself an anti-federalist at the federal level, a county anarchist, but a municipal socialist. Because if my neighbor's dog is barking in the middle of the night, I feel certainly entitled to say something about that to them in the morning, because I got to get a good night's sleep. But going back to.
Yes, we live in communities, and everybody has a responsibility to their neighbor. It's that's certainly a thing.
Well, and it also gets down to, again, we have this notion that people can't get along in America, but in some parts it's because we are not considering the nuance between the levels of government and the expectation of privacy or property rights, and how those can be different when you're living in, say, an unincorporated rural area of a county with a lot more with a lot more, sparse population, or lower population density than in tightly packed areas. But again, going back to this notion that we have about law too, I'm very wary about. And think about some of the realities that are coming to the surface as we see, say, the Trump administration ignore decisions that are handed down from various judges. And legislatures should be wary of this. And I often think back to an earlier America, as a pre-Civil War, maybe pre-1850s era America. There was a Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall, one of the most eloquent Supreme Court justices that we've ever had, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. One of the most important and things that he ever said was that to tax is to control. And there's been a narrative against taxation that has ensued throughout America. But I think that, again, we have tools at hand to break the wariness that we've had with regards to taxation. And the reason that we have tools to break that is because if we have a number of different types of monies and are wary about how they weigh against each other, then we can begin to take into hand taxation and the control that is implicit in taxation at town levels. So uh, when I saw, say, Lyft or Uber, Airbnb, all these sharing economy companies flouting the quote unquote law, I saw that as the failure of legislation, of a group of elected officials to write something down and have no tool to enforce it, and to have some expectation of, oh, how have we enforced other laws that have been written down? Well, when it comes to traffic or it comes to things that are occurring in public, you can rely on coercion. You can rely on the sheriff's department or a police officer. But when it comes to people's homes, we have a different expectation of privacy. And yet we all pay property tax. And we all pay sales tax. If you start moving this into a tax system as opposed to an expectation of people to be afraid of going to jail, then it's a different world that we live in. And we've set aside this.
Well, that is part of what's happened here. I mean, when you have Airbnb and VRBO, they have allowed the participation in markets where taxation would normally be much higher. If you have a rental property, or if you have something that's primarily intended to be rented out to other people or to be populated by somebody who's not going to be living there long term, you're supposed to pay a higher tax, or you're supposed to have a certain license. And so what Airbnb and VRBO did was allow for people who didn't have that licensure to just throw their homes or their rooms into the mix with people who were playing by the rules. And that sort of I played by the rules, or I didn't play by the rules, is, I don't know, one of the things that sort of rubs me the wrong way about how all this works is either we have established rules and we're all going to follow them, or we just got chaos. And if we're going to have chaos, then let's embrace the chaos, but let's not pretend like these rules exist and then selectively enforce them. That it's the selective enforcement that gets me the worst, because I feel like there's this sense that the laws exist and that you're a criminal if you break them. But and there's another take on that, which is the laws exist and they make criminals of all of us, and those laws are selectively enforced upon certain peoples and at certain times to achieve ends.
Well, so again, and I think the gentrification, the problems in gentrification that we see Airbnb and VRBO bringing out are very important. But let's think also that it's not just happening with Airbnb and VRBO, but Blackstone, and we're seeing commercial interests buy up a lot of property. Why are they doing so? This is where I think it's very important to begin to look at taxes. So one, VRBO in Basalt or Aspen, Colorado has very different reality in the circumstances as opposed to Airbnb. VRBO, I'm not aware that it was possible, if ever, to rent out a room. Airbnb, it was. And so Airbnb was about a smaller time window, but also about a fractionalization of an asset. So if you had an apartment in or a spare bedroom in New York City, people were willing to rent that out to somebody for, God, $300, $400 a night. Who knows? But VRBO was about people with second homes in Aspen, Colorado, and homes that they only used for 2 weeks, maybe a month out of the year. And the idea that home was sitting there languishing for the other 10 months at least of the year. So this is, and then we turn and look at Colorado today and look at the number of people who own their homes or live in their homes in Western resort towns along the Western slope. That has been drastically falling. But part of the problem that Colorado has is that they have an income tax that keeps their property tax suppressed. And so people can live in Phoenix or Chicago or even Denver, and have a second home in Colorado, and pay almost nothing in property tax. And the only time that they have to sort of pay the government a lot of money is whenever they sell that tax, because those states rely on income tax and sales tax rather than property tax. So this is a problem, and this is furthermore a problem again whenever we come to Blackstone. Why is Blackstone buying up all of these houses? One, because they can adjust the rent to pay property tax where it's higher, but boy, especially whenever property tax is really low in a state, they can hold on to an asset and make tons of money in rent in the meantime, and they are hedged against things like inflation of the dollar. So as it would surprise people, I'm very for higher property taxes, and that doesn't go over so well in Texas. But part of the problem that we have in say states like Texas, where there is no income tax, and people are paying quite high property taxes, well, it's pegged to the dollar rather than the economic output of certain areas. And so people really feel the inflation of the dollar, and the problem of trying to keep up, but it's
So what you're saying is that property taxes keeps communities more local, that it tends to make it stickier, because otherwise, if you have low property taxes, then what can tend to happen is you have these outside investments or these outside influences that take away the local close-knit communities, because now you have these absentee owners that are owning the property and maybe even forcing the people who would otherwise live in these communities out.
absolutely. And I also think, how does a town regain or keep some control on the businesses and the things that go on in the town? And we've fallen into this trap of requiring policemen. Policemen were not police comes in the Latin root from the word to aid, to render aid. And the notion that it was about coercion is comes late to the game in the it, and and how is the better form of getting people to do things? It's through money. Well, if we raise our property tax and towns are in control of that, and ostensibly also begin to come into control of the economic engine of the town, then we come to what we often think of as like some bucolic post 1812 America, but I think a lot of that had to do with taxes that were more bound to local economic output. And so when I look at a town and they want to set up rules for people who own property, for what goes on Main Street, et cetera, if if they were more in control of the money of the town, uh, then they could be doing what the federal government does, which is to pay for the things that they want to see, rather than mandating them.
So I want to think about what Airbnb and VRBO really provide. So if you think about these companies, they're a platform. They're a way whereby you can establish a two-sided market. And a two-sided market being, you've got people who have a thing that they want to monetize, and then you have people who want to use that thing. So they have essentially a big marketing problem where they need to bring these two sides together. So you've got to get the inventory online. And it's the same thing with Lyft and Uber. You've got the cars, they've got to be available, and then you got to have the riders. And so these two-sided markets are a tricky thing, because if you don't have a pretty even balance, then there's a lot of frustration on both sides. And it's the same thing that can happen with dating. I mean, there's a lot of these. So if you think about the concept of a two-sided market, it starts to creep up a lot as you think about a lot of different businesses. And so, what do VRBO and Airbnb really provide? Well, they're providing this platform where you can load your house or your room into the mix, and then people can search and find a place to stay. But one of the things that they really need to do is broker disputes. And this, I think they fail at the most. It's like if you have some kind of a problem, it's really hard for these companies to find themselves in the middle of this, because what side are they going to take? Are they going to take the long term play, which is, oh, we want to, err on the side of the people who have the inventory, because that's the big hard thing to get online here, versus the customers who, come and go at the whims of whatever. So, eBay, I think, traditionally has had a problem here as well, like trying to broker these disputes. And where you see a lot of people get really, really frustrated with the experiences on these platforms is when they have some kind of a bad experience. They got sold a bill of goods for a property which ended up not being quite what they expected, or you've got some people that came in and stayed at a place and trashed it, and then, what is the person who has the facility supposed to do? And the first thing people often reach towards is the platform that brought these two parties together, especially since, as these companies try to find new paths towards monetization, they offer things like insurance and, trip support and whatever, and they fail miserably at both of these. And this has been, one of the primary frustrations that people have started to have. It's like, why am I on Airbnb if I could just go to a hotel and I don't have to clean the place, I don't have to deal with any of these weirdo fees? It's not that much cheaper, and God forbid that I actually have to deal with the horrible support that's established here, versus just going down to the front desk and saying there's a problem, and lo and behold, somebody will run up there, fix the problem, or the maid will come in and clean the room.
Well, so yes, they part of what they bring is the matching of the people with an asset and the people who are looking for whatever experience. But I think their best means of ameliorating these issues is with what they have, social credit. They have a social credit score, and it's interesting how wary we are of the government having a social credit score, and yet how easily we accept it when it comes to being rated as a rider or a driver uh, for Lyft or Uber, or being rated as a guest or as a host when it comes to VRBO. So I think that they should lean more heavily into those. I know that they take some. I know that there's gamification of that social credit score, but it's a very, to me, is the effective way where they can make these experiences better. And you idealize hotels, but before we had options between staying in someone's home and staying in a hotel, the hotels didn't have such a rosy reputation, and they
Well,
also
this
had.
is how this is how the hotels started to differentiate themselves in the face of Airbnb and VRBO. They had to get better.
Well, but they also just charge higher rates so that they can be sure and cover any issues that come. So,
Yeah, I'm not so sure that it's cheaper anymore. I think that that's part of that disrupt. There's always that first early period where it's cheaper, but then, as the professionals start to get in there and they realize how to value things correctly, the it's cheap starts to go away. And usually things being cheaper because they're mispriced, not because there's an actual value to be had. The number of places where you can rent out somebody's room from somebody who's doing it casually, that's dwindled. That's far from the norm on
it
either of these platforms.
I mean, absolutely. That's so very true. And I think part of the problem that VRBO and Airbnb especially have had is an inability to curtail the fees. They've let some of these middlemen, rent seekers, sort of work their way in through the cleaning aspect of it, and other fees. And I agree. VRBO, Airbnb used to be cheaper options, and in some ways they are. If there's the economy aspect of it. If you're renting a home with 8 bedrooms instead of of 10 hotel rooms, I still think you get quite a bit of discount with using VRBO, but um, that's less so whenever you are just maybe two people or a family of four on vacation. But I also think about all the amenities that you get when you're actually have somebody's home, and those extend to yard locations, locations that are cordoned off from this zoning you prize so highly. Um, you know, it's not hotels aren't always located in somewhere that I want to be whenever I'm traveling about. So um, I, I don't know. The fees are a problem, though. I'll definitely agree the fees are a problem. But there's, I think that we also just see a lack of more companies having maybe the amount of because we haven't mentioned Hipcamp. Hipcamp sort of does this, but it does this with your yard. There are more tech companies that have brought the matching to bear, and also the fractionalization of assets and time windows, but they're less popular. So I think that people will turn towards competitors of VRBO. And part of the problem here too, we should also add, part of the problem is that in reality,
Wait, I think this one's lesser known. I've never even heard of this before. What is Hipcamp? What are these guys doing? What's the sharing economy here? Like people are renting out their campsites or letting people camp in their backyard?
yeah, you can Hipcamp is pretty aggressive in contacting people with locations that they find desirable, and saying, would you consider setting up like a quarter acre on the edge of your lot, and it operates by sending GPS coordinates instead of addresses, and so you drive along, and you pull off the side of the road, and there's a nice little campsite for you. um
Now this has got to be even worse with respect to people abusing this. I can't imagine that there
well
aren't
it's
people who just trash these campsites and just leave it in a complete disarray.
I'm not sure of what the experiences of people are. Yeah, you could look in Santa Fe. There was a lady who had a tree house that was on Hipcamp, like sort of uh, a, a, a just a tree house up in a thing, and but it also came with a chance to pet the buffalo herd next door, and some lady got gored. So that's a lawsuit going on outside of Santa Fe recently. But going back to VRBO, and the part of the reason that we haven't seen competitors is because VRBO isn't VRBO anymore. VRBO has been captured by private equity. Look up HomeAway, and I'm not sure if you've ever heard of HomeAway, but HomeAway buys all of these nascent sharing economy vacation sites. I don't believe they own Hipcamp. Maybe they've purchased Hipcamp since I quit paying so much attention. But HomeAway bought VRBO and bought any other site that was coming along. Now they haven't acquired Airbnb, but whenever you list with any of these sites that HomeAway owns, they all still exist, but they share the database. And so if you register with Escapia and put your home there, it's going to actually go onto all of these sites that still have an independent front end, but all share the same database on the back end. This, I would
Well,
say,
this is definitely one of those. How do you solve the two-sided market problem? Because they're busy buying up all these different places, and now they have this much expanded database. So yeah, I can definitely see how in aggregation these things tend to work a little bit better, especially if you get used to looking at VRBO as a brand, and you're like, well, I wonder if they've got anything in New Zealand.
well, and if we wonder why the innovation of the sharing economy has stalled out, it is because the private equity model which we talk a lot about with regards to how caustic that is uh, to what the true value corporations and companies and the private market and capitalism brings to the world. Well, they stall that out, and they do so as we look at this with the illusion of choice. So I would imagine a lot of people are surprised whenever they're using any of these sites to turn around and find that the same private equity group has gone around and bought all of the competition so that it can suck up all of the profit that's coming in from the sharing economy innovation.
I think that there's a coming world where the middleman private equity platform goes away. This just seems like exactly what they had intended to do to disrupt. We're right back to where we started. Someday there's got to be this actual mechanism where you can build these. There's no intermediaries, and people can start doing this peer to peer more, because that I actually hadn't realized the level of consolidation that had happened with HomeAway here, but it sure seems like there isn't as much of a peer-to-peer nature of this, and I'm just sharing my couch as it is just this is all professional stuff.
This is part of why I'm both I'm glad to see the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, and a lot of traders or investors in the market don't like to see that. But part of the reason that private equity persists is because they can carry over times when they're not making profit on this model um, by borrowing debt. And when there is when there's very little cost to them for borrowing more money, this is also why the private equity is so strong. It you can have exponential amount of debt that is borrowed whenever you distribute the risk of the borrower across. It's more attractive to lenders to have a group of people, and for that also to be quote unquote private rather than public. Gives them the ability not to have to report all the intricacies into their agreements. So, but the best way to weed them out or thin them out and find those who are truly buying distressed companies and figuring out a way to make them a better company or selling them for parts is to remove the ease with which they can buy debt and carry on the mirage of profits. So I'm glad to see the Federal Reserve continuing to try to raise interest rates. I think part of the growth of private equity in all these different sectors that we have seen came because there were players who understood that about the borrowing of debt and took advantage of the very low interest rates. And think about when we almost dipped into negative interest rates for a while, and they could be paid for accruing more debt. So the Federal Reserve has been very adamant with trying to raise interest rates and to continue raising them. The Trump administration has, Donald Trump, famously has tried to lean on Jerome Powell or to threaten other types of intervention or nationalizing the Fed. But the Fed has held their ground, and it's also interesting to me that Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, has talked in their discussions about their trade policy about a greater concern for Main Street over Wall Street, and yet it's ironic to me that they still are constantly lobbying the Fed to lower their interest rates. But maybe that's just a charade. I'm not sure. Anyway, I don't know if I have much more to add. Well, I could probably go on forever about the whole municipal socialization side of the sharing economy and municipal and private monies, but that might be another episode, or that might never happen because I might bore everybody to death. Any other thoughts or questions about private or sharing economy?
Just my last thought on this is I love the concept of connecting people directly without intermediaries. It's, to me, one of the promises of blockchain. It's one of the promises of what we can do with peer-to-peer networks. I hope that as we continuously develop new technology, that we try to build out more peer-to-peer stuff, that we could try to eliminate these types of companies that sit in between individuals, unless they're providing some real value. And that real value I find in the brokering of disputes. I don't think the court system is really set up to handle these small scale disputes that happen between people. And so if insurance companies or platforms that, purport to bring together people that want to do peer-to-peer economic type activities, and I think the promise of VRBO and Airbnb and Uber and Lyft, they all had this grandiose notion of how we could have this thing that was sold to us as the sharing economy, but they really were just another rent-seeking vampire that didn't really do the principal job, which was to connect people together and to help broker disputes when they came up, or to provide a reasonable insurance against bad behavior. And so I think, as innovators think about how do they actually create something that can be not this kind of thing, it has to be where these systems are set up in such a way that you don't get tempted to become the profit leeching vampire. And I think that this is where, in my mind, the promise of smart contracts and things like Bitcoin can really come into play, because you can start to have autonomous systems that are automated and audited, and now you can sort of set things in motion, and there's no longer that need to have a human or an entity or private equity to come in later to rescue that investment and make people back their money, so that there was a reason to invest in it in the first place. But rather, you can set up self-sustaining systems that operate under the principles that they're supposed to, and can't be altered because they're immutable. I look towards that future, and I think about that whenever I see stuff like this, because it's that enshittification, that term, and you see it constantly. There's these halcyon days of when things were good, and then they just degrade over time. And I just wish that we could have nice things and keep them. That's, I guess, my lament.
Smart contracts. Smart contracts will give us nice things. We are remiss in not mentioning, I think, a site that born a lot of this idea, and that's couchsurfing.com. And couchsurfing has stayed true, and also there was no financial aspect. There was no payment that was ever tendered for couchsurfing.com. That was actually sharing part of your asset. It stayed true to its roots. I'm not sure how many people still engage in couch surfing or what the experiences are there. But as we think about all of these examples of the quote unquote sharing economy, we should always maybe take a glance back at couch surfing and other fractionalized assets in which there is no exchange of money. It's based on a social credit system and trust. So something to think about. But yes, smart contracts, I think, hold are a great innovation that will improve this notion of our fractionalized assets.
All right. Well, I think we covered it in some good detail. I don't have anything else. So good discussion, and we'll see you next time on FOMO.